Okay, I'm going to return to the Grasshopper for Rhino, the 123s, ABCs, and I was into Mesh Tools nodes, and I had them all up and running. I did this first section loosely, getting them operating. I did want to spend time on the other nodes that come from going into analysis and utilities. Um, a lot said. I do have some pretty nuts geometries happening here. I think I'll just put this script up on GitHub and have people have questions about it as we go through. I'm just going to talk a little bit about it without showing too many demos. Constructing mesh obviously pulls things out. Faces are an interesting thing versus thinking of their corners as vertices. Think of them as numbers in a numbered order of how you actually put together those. So think of faces a little bit differently. I have a little script here that's kind of fun. I keep using the same ignore this one for now. This one should be down here. I keep using the same mesh, which is the skull only right here. And there's a floor mesh as well. I'm using this one on the ground, which is pretty small. That said, I'm going to stay focused on what I can do with this skull. Going in and deconstructing that mesh, reducing the point count, finding the length of that point count, and then jittering and making that move through a line system. Very interesting little script that I can take this skull here. If you have a look, I'm having trouble scrolling in for some reason. It just doesn't want to move. Basically, I can have a pipe system of, very strange. Just go out of this for a second. There we go. And hit zoom extends all. There we go, and I should be able to zoom in there and fix it. But you'll see I basically wrote a little script that jitters lines along moving those randomly reduced points of counting those and then having them more or less. And what's nice about that is as you take a look at that list count as it moves up and down, I've moved that in direction with the jitter to make mesh pipes, which will move fast. And I'm very happy with this little script to kind of make geometries and have geometries disappear by simple geometry. So tucked inside this GitHub code and GH code, it'll be on GitHub, are all these little examples of triangulation, dealing with this skull or dealing with this mesh underneath. And you're going to go through and see how it converts things to quads, how you restudy in Rhino when you go in, you hit show edges to find out if things are 3D printable. It'll say pick a poly surface and it'll tell you what are naked edges, interior edges, and non-manifold edges, and you're going to want to keep those to a 0 count. Otherwise, you're not going to have a watertight thing, and it'll be hard to send to the printer. Exploding mesh gives you the faces. Definitely mesh triangulation turns any triangulation in the node from rectangle to triangles. Face boundaries are made apparent. That's no problem. Turning them into face circles is kind of fun. This one is inclusion. It's not really working so much with the skull. I had a little sphere on here on a point. So if I grab a point and I set that into this section, if I set this one point to that one, I'm going to end up with a sphere. And then if I generate another point around it, like here, and I set that one here, to set one point, I can then take that geometry while this one's here and I can move it through, and as it enter and leaves that, you'll see it goes true or false as inclusion. I grabbed the same mesh and grabbed a centroid of that, and evaluate surface tools pretty nice in a sense of finding out if we grab that. I'm going to slide it down here and we're evaluating the surface. I like this closest point. I chose the centroid as the point in there. And then I said, where on the mesh is the closest point? And it pinpoints that right there as soon as you plug it in. It's a very good tool. I'm not sure why I left that number slider up there. Constructing a mesh on the ground plane. I just went in and analyzed mesh naked edge, which will give you the V list, the A list, and the B list. Which I honestly, as I get down into here, meshes I don't use so often, I get a little... I just haven't put it into good practice yet. This little mesh at the bottom, which I brought in, surface evaluation, so a mesh closest point evaluation on that, start line distance on that. A lot of control you can gain just making simple geometries and activating the mesh eval. You will need the mesh closest point as the parameter to pull in a mesh eval on a surface. So if you're used to doing a surface evaluation tool, which you use quite often, over here, surface eval, you're going to find that you're going to need that parameter to find that point within it. You can't use an MD slider on this, so that's just a little note. Down here, runtime messages. This is interesting because you can add attributes, and I understand this by looking into Python in the sense of why it would add more attributes. So basically, you can come in here and add whatever you want. You can clear those values as you go, and it just allows your mesh to have more attributes about it. It's pretty simple. We're going to keep flying, and as I go into this little script down here, you're going to see that I basically get into the habit of making that little skull. But I think that's fun because I can populate it. I can do things with it. I'm not sure what I'm doing there with the sphere. We'll find out later. Populate meshes from there, in order or out of order is kind of fun. And then in the same breath, I've got a little square mesh on the bottom that I've grabbed a circle. I've grabbed a surface around that. And then that surface UV count, I'm able to bring it into I think a trimmed, like a UV mesh. I can actually have the count on that mesh to what I want, taking from that surface. So that's a cool little tool that you can play with the numbers. And you can see I'm meshing with the UV count here, so the points went screwy up here. My example nodes kind of try and bring a lot of things together so you see the interface and what's different between them. This one's interesting. This is the settings custom. Haven't gotten too much into it for building that brep and finding out all the things I can do within that, but it is a pretty cool thing to just analyze and find out what you can do to a brep and set the settings to that brep. So you go in there in detail. Remember, when you're lost in a node, just right click and go through and try and find out all the information it'll give you. It usually makes as much sense logically as they've written it. Simple. Settings here, you can set settings to setting quality. You can set setting speed to meshes, which is nice. And they're tags on this end, so they're really just bringing that in the same way you bring out a tag on the other side. Center box I built, capped the holes on it. Now the reason I did that, I'm not sure why I capped holes on it. I would have done that for a cylinder. Maybe I changed it to a center box after, and then simplifying that into a mesh. How do you take create a mesh that represents a brep, boundary representation? So you are going to have a habit in Rhino of wanting to jump between surfaces and meshes, and you've got to have a little bit of language as to why that works. We'll continue with that little skull. I think it's the skull shape down here. I should have imported it. I'm wondering where it's gone off to. Where's my little skull? My mesh is on that. It's going to be around there somewhere. There's no way I just brought in a point. What did I do up here? What have I done? Mesh spray. No, why would I bring in a mesh spray? That's strange. I think I just made a little mistake there and brought in the wrong item. Let's go back and grab this one. Haul that one over. See what happens. And, obvious why I had a mesh spray, because I was taking it over the blur mesh. And you need colors in your mesh, which may not be set from my past script because I might have turned it off. But as you remember, I was doing some mesh sprays here, and what allows you to do is to have a further function on the visualization. Keep in mind, meshes allow for a lot more visualization things than the surfaces. Sorry not to spend too much time on that, but I did have it set. Pretty interesting to blurring out the iterations of those mesh colors. Say you're using that for documentation or pulling images off of here. The mesh itself, I've got skull again. Culling faces out of it as possible. You just set up a number pattern. I just typed in a series of booleans, true or false, in the pattern to get into that. Culling vertices as well. Very nice little tool. As you change it, you can start with these beautiful geometries that can be shapes. So that original mesh with this culled pattern, get into the same thing you were doing with vertices and getting into sets and getting into sequence culling data. Now you're actually doing it to meshes. So I find that interesting. I like the gene pool, so I'm using that on a deleting faces, and I have the ability to come in here and have whichever indices of how many there are in this mesh. And if there's 200, well, then I can set as many as I want to kind of call out. Just thought I'd throw a gene pool in there for fun. Deleting vertices as well. See, if you got that one deleting faces, that one's deleting vertices, and I'm using a gene pool just to show you that's a tool to do that. A disjoint mesh that you can bring together by a mesh joint. So mesh joint, I think, is welding. Welds meshes together, and disjoint separates them. Let's keep rolling because we're at 9 minutes. This little pattern, we've got the same skull coming into it. Mesh shadows are very nice because they're actually projection down onto the ground plane if possible. So the mesh shadow from that surface is becoming this shape down here. I think that's kind of interesting to think about. So that is casting that shape, shadow on the ground. So a nice way of thinking, going 2D with a lot of things from what objects and the positions they're in. Mesh split plane. is exactly that. So if we come up here and we take a look at the top half and the bottom half, you're splitting your mesh. Mesh smooth, that's exactly what it's doing as a strength. So you can really have an effect on how the visualization, not just the visualization, but actually what that mesh is appearing is. Aligning faces is nice. Are there any aligned faces? No. And it's doing a little count of those, but it would be faces that are in the same direction. So if you look at that over here, it should say specifically align all nearby mesh. And then you'll have your outcome mesh, which is the result, which will be a little different. Flipping matrix is nice. It's just turning your normals going in from out. You can visualize those normals if you like. And the last section, if we have time, I brought over the mesh again, stayed pretty focused, then went in and used call unused vertices. So if there's anything hanging around you don't want, get rid of it. Flipping the mesh, once again, does very similar to what we did over here by flip mesh as well, except this one is flip the normal vectors of the mesh, and this one goes so far in as reverse the direction of the mesh. So that's a little different than how you're thinking about it. But find out the difference between that. Mesh unify normals. And this is what I'd be doing if I didn't have like a mesh mixer, or I had another program that was fixing. I'd try and run through any trouble with anything that was happening, because it's kind of an analysis tool for how can I be the doctor and fix up your meshes for you. And it might satisfy your problems or not. This is a nice little one. It's turning everything, all triangles it possibly can into squares, and this is turning all squares back into triangles. And that's an interesting tool which will make things planar and non-planar in what you're looking at. Keep in mind that a triangular mesh has to be planar, and it's not necessary so for a 4-point mesh. Unifying mesh tells you again if it's possible to do it, and count that actually having an effect on welding the mesh is similar to then welding the mesh. And you saw this kind of all happening before in these kind of little tools down here with dealing with mesh, joining a mesh, but they seem to be repeated in different nodes that actually give you more data on that. The last exposure, this is dealing more with, I think, of light and rays, and we're going to end with oculus and exposure in that, because like what exactly is that? How much actually is covered by that? So if you think of the sun passing and catching its rays onto it, it's nice to set up the shape and then the obstructions to that. And I don't have any in this one, but there's a nice little example down here I did by populating a little mesh in the bottom, and I have 5 points. But let's say we put on 12 or 17, and I have an object that is basically that mesh above. And if I projected those rays at a negative, if I projected the obstructions in a negative z direction, would it hit those points? And it says out of those 15 points in a Boolean, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And then I think there's a little bit of data here in the occlusion. If you take a look at that, it will basically say the same thing, but give you a grafted list of what's included or not. And you can use that data to then go farther and build further geometries. Hopefully that's helpful. We're at 13 minutes. I don't enjoy working in meshes. I know I definitely have to. They do speed things up a bit, so there's a need for that. Certainly as we look towards fabrication, I'm going to have to think about these more often. In a sense of taking the materials I can actually fabricate instead of imagining NURBS curved surfaces of soap bubbles and fabric all the time, and fluid wax and casting metal. I may end up having to fabricate it with welding and cutting and all that machining. Anyway, that's a little fast. It's not my best video, that's for sure. Thanks for watching. We're going to go back into either fabrication or this new site, which I'm very excited about. I've been invited to ARA Jewelry Design, which is offering an incredible program for tons of shelf items or user objects or snippets. And as I start to take those apart, I'll try and do some things with those geometries to make that an interesting site for jewelers to share, but also creatives to share. Thanks so much for watching.